Last week, it became crystal clear neither winners nor losers had a post-Brexit plan. Well, they better come up with one fast. As the pound plummets amid a run on the London commercial property market, keep calm and carry on won't cut it as policy for the next leader of the United Kingdom. What is the plan for Britain? What's the plan to avoid contagion to the world economy? The problem is there were two sorts of leave votes, those who voted against the Brussels bureaucracy and those raging against globalization. That rage is not confined, by the way, to the British Isles. What future for big global trade deals in a world where citizens feel the rules are stacked against the little guy? Is the answer to inequality to shut the border? Today in the France-WENTE debate, after Brexit, should we worry? Joining us from London, he's a former chief executive of the Taxpayers Alliance, Matthew Sinclair, of public relations firm Westbourne Communications. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And you voted?
I voted leave.
Oh, you voted leave, okay. From Oslo, Norway, Sunny Kapoor, managing director of economic and public policy think tank Redefined. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Conservative Paris area regional councillor Franck Marguin heads the Paris Region Economic Development Agency. Welcome back as well, sir.
Good evening.
The France-WENTE debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. Our hashtag F24debate. Let's start with the British pound. This Thursday, it has rebounded slightly after falling to its lowest level against the dollar since 1985. Sunny Kapoor, how low will it go?
There are people out there who are hypothesizing that it might go to parity with dollar. That's $1 for every pound, which would be unprecedented, at least within the lifetime of, I think, most of the people alive right now. And a lot depends on what happens between now and September, when a new prime minister is put in place, and whether or not it seems clear if they are going to push the red button of Brexit or not. I still think it's quite likely that we are not going to actually see a Brexit. In fact, I have promised to eat my hat on TV if we do leave. And I think that's
on France-WENTE, I hope.
I'll eat several hats if you wish, but I'm hopeful that sanity will prevail, that the financial and economic shock we are seeing in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit vote will focus minds, that the fact that it was, as you rightly said, a divided vote, it wasn't a vote to actually leave the EU, because most people voting didn't even know what the EU actually does. And a number of people who cast it as a protest vote against, for example, immigration, they think that 30% of the UK population is foreign-born, whereas the real figure is only about 5% or so. So one hopes that between now and September, enough people will have regret, enough people will know real information and facts, and enough economic shock would have focused minds that there will be a majority to remain, and we will not actually see a prime minister who will press the red button that will take us out of the EU, that will lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom, and that will lead to the mother of economic crisis.
The mother of economic crisis. Well, we can argue about whether or not you're in denial over that vote, Sony, but let me ask you about that. The mother of economic crisis. For instance, is the pound plummeting a bad news story?
It depends on who you ask, but I would say overall for the country as a whole, yes, it is a bad news story. The UK has a twin deficit, both a current account deficit that is at a near record level, as well as a fiscal deficit that we were about to sort of eliminate back to in 2020, which is now not going to happen. And that is a very dangerous place to be in. And this is the kind of thing, the kind of crisis that is usually seen in emerging markets. A lot of money that made it to the UK, seeing the UK as a safe haven after the euro crisis, is now starting to leave. And as the pound continues to plummet, more and more money will vote with its feet. So we will find it increasingly hard to actually finance our current account deficit. Inflation is likely to pick up. The consumer is likely to get hit both from the recession as well as from rising prices, because the UK is quite import dependent. And the UK's reputation as a stable, safe haven for investments, a safe haven for political stability, for policy stability, is in tatters. We are the laughing stock of the world, and no investor is going to think of the same way about the UK again.
Matthew Sinclair, your reaction?
I think the idea that the UK referendum is going to be overturned relies first on you'd have to have some discussions, and EU leaders at the moment, their firm position is no discussions before Article 50 is triggered. Equally, from all of the serious UK political leaders, all of the people who might take office come September, the signal's been very clear that the vote was to leave and the vote will be to leave. And all of these, well, people thought X and the reality is Y, and therefore this vote doesn't count. I mean, you start applying that standard to democratic elections and you end up cancelling them. I think the reality is that the UK is going to leave the EU. What is unclear at the moment is quite what leaving the EU means. What's unclear isn't whether we're going to leave so much as how we leave. Do we leave and do the deal which is eminently possible to do, a deal which serves the interests of both sides, the EU and the UK, maintaining the free trade which has served the prosperity of both? Or does a desire either for protectionism, to try and move financial services somewhere else in the EU, which won't work, but they might try, or a desire to punish the UK, is that going to lead to some kind of trade breakdown? But if you watch the debates during the referendum campaign, when both sides were arguing over who was most in favour of free trade, whether leave was going to allow the UK to do more trade deals externally and maintain trade with the EU, versus Remain saying it could best safeguard trade with the EU. I just think we need to be careful of overreacting and seeing this as an enormous reaction against globalisation. There are some voters who voted leave, particularly over immigration, and those voters are often those who've struggled with globalisation. But the idea that the UK has changed its position from having been historically an extremely free trading nation is just patently untrue from anyone who lived through the campaign here.
All right, Matthew, I'm going to ask you how it's going so far. But first, we're going to listen to the Governor of the Bank of England, whose job under normal circumstances is to say boring stuff that reassures investors. The problem is Mark Carney is alarmingly interesting these days.
The UK has entered a period of uncertainty and significant economic adjustment. The efforts of the Bank of England will not be able to fully and immediately offset the market and economic volatility that can be expected while this adjustment proceeds. More fundamentally, the future potential of this economy and its implications for jobs, real wages and wealth are not the gifts of the Bank of England, but will be driven by major decisions made by others within the public and private sectors.
Matthew Sinclair, what say you to that and to Sonny Kapoor talking about that prediction that some have made of parity between the pounds and the dollar, the pound dropping to parity?
Look, predicting Forex markets is a fool's game, but I think he's absolutely right to say there's enormous economic uncertainty. The UK was facing a situation where it was a non-Eurozone, non-Schengen zone economy in an EU being redefined in its economic institutions, its political institutions to serve the Eurozone and the Schengen zone. And making that, there was no certain choice in front of us. There was no choice which wasn't going to create uncertainty. But what we have done is we've brought a lot of it forward. We are confronting that uncertainty in one go. Now that has the potential prize of allowing us to address the problem rather than trying to muddle through, rather than doing this endless dance of kicking the can down the road, as we've seen in the Eurozone crisis. But it has enormous risks. The risks in particular are that the Eurozone either tries to, and frankly, particularly France, either tries to divert activity to its own shores in a kind of protection protectionist instincts. It won't work. It's much more like, I mean, from talking to senior financial services people in London in recent days and weeks, I think if you offer them a choice between a kick in the privates and relocating to Paris, they probably should take the kick in the privates. Then there's also this idea that they're going to deter other exits, that it's essential to the stability of the EU to punish the UK. And again, I think it'll be counterproductive. It's much more likely to create a deep economic shock which threatens the stability of a Eurozone still very vulnerable to asymmetric shocks. But those instincts are there and they are real. And that's why there is a huge amount of uncertainty about whether a reasonable deal which maintains market access in both directions and means that companies across the EU can access the low quality adjusted cost financial intermediation in London. That's why that is at risk, and that's why there is uncertainty. But that risk can be addressed if sensible voices on both sides win out, and that risk was going to need to be confronted as the EU changed in order to accommodate the Schengen and Eurozones, which it needs to do. I don't think anyone in the UK has any illusions that the club couldn't be run in the interests of a country like us, which was so atypical of the rest of the EU.
All right,
Sorry, go on.
Let me get the reaction of Franck Marguin on this. First of all, this idea that a good disruption is what's needed to reshuffle the deck and make it saner for everyone.
I'm not convinced that you always rebuild something when you are breaking it. It's like a toy, for kids. And I'm very surprised about the anti-French words I've heard from my colleague. I just want to remind to all our, people listening to us that Britain has decided to leave. We didn't decide to leave. We didn't, push them to leave. We just, encouraged them to stay. We didn't want them to leave. We thought that, Britain brought to Europe certain, originality and certain way of doing business. So I'm very, very surprised and actually a bit sad that this gentleman is campaigning anti-France. Now they've decided to leave. We have to reinvent, obviously, the business, and we have to reinvent our, way of trading together. And yes, if France will, welcome some corporates or some businesses, in Paris, I think that's because we have already demands. I'm, the chairman of the Economic Development Agency, and I should tell you that we got today few English corporates who need to have an access to France, and will have contacted us to establish part of their business, sort of subsidiary or some people, because they don't want to take a risk. When you are a businessman, the only thing you don't do that you don't take risk without being sure you have taken this risk to get return. So a businessman takes risks for business. They never take risks for politics. So you could see that many chairmen just, trying to preserve their shareholders' return by, thinking of moving on the continent.
This is a crucial issue, isn't it? That whether or not you take risks.
Political, yeah.
Sonny Kapoor, it's the outgoing Prime Minister of Britain who coined the term the big bazooka approach in a different context. This idea that you need to take risks sometimes and get out of the usual Brussels muddle and compromise, and actually to have change, you need to take risks.
I think what the Prime Minister essentially has done is turn the bazooka to our own head in the United Kingdom and pull the trigger. I'm afraid, and I'd like to apologize to the rest of the EU on behalf of my country. I think, frankly, we've been assholes with the rest of the EU in our dealings. Matthew was being extremely disingenuous, trying to make the point that somehow the EU is developing against the UK's interests, when the facts are exactly the opposite.
That's exactly the opposite.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, English has become the de facto language of the EU. The single market was a British idea. The new commission under Juncker has been talking about reducing regulation. The number of legislations has gone down very sharply. And more, the EU has been focused in a direction, liberal, free trade, strong competition policy, etc., which are all essentially British influence. And that exactly at a time when our influence was peaking, when we were doing really well, when we were recovering from the financial crisis.
May I say something here? Because
you've got to look at what's been happening since 2000.
I just want to talk about that because it's very important to understand that the British have decided to leave because the British politicians have done a job for them to believe that if they leave, they would be happier. It has nothing to do with Europe. If you think about what Europe did, they have no influence on immigration. That they are because England is not under Schengen agreement.
Absolutely.
We don't want to keep their sovereignty because if we allow them to leave, that means their sovereignty is entirely intact. Otherwise, you could not take. So I think it's a bit unfair to talk about Europe when actually the politicians in the UK have campaigned to leave because they are too, I would say, focused on their own deal and their own sovereignty. I'm not criticizing the British people who has voted against. I'm talking about the British politicians who have campaigned and they got what they wanted to get. So please don't blame Europe. Blame the internal organizations of the UK, which were not working well.
Let me bring in Matthew Sinclair, because we're going to have to go to the break. Go ahead, Matthew.
You've got to be realistic about this. Sony's describing the world before 2008. There was a time where the UK had a huge role in, for example, financial regulation. And a lot of financial regulation is telling other economies to adopt the kind of standards that exist in the UK.
Yes, but regulations are not that bad.
Crisis. What changed was the Eurozone crisis. What changed was that all of a sudden you started to see rules coming out repeatedly, which and particularly addressing areas like financial services.
And you have my understanding is that the English population has voted against liberalism.
No, but
Matthew Sinclair.
The UK disagrees to such an extent that it was going to court. I mean, to think if any other country which had sex of such importance to it,
if you live in a family, you could have disruption
in order to defend against repeated rules which were infringing upon its interests. I think that shows, and I don't want to see this as a hostile, as a matter of hostility, because I think there's every way we can come to an agreement where we work together better as friendly neighbours, rather than trying to keep the UK in a club in which it doesn't fit. Now, that's going to require saying no to some of the protectionist instincts that exist on both sides.
All right,
and both saying no to the idea of punishing the UK, which will be counterproductive.
We have to take a quick break.
We can work as neighbours and to pretend.
Matthew Sinclair, we have to take a quick break, and we'll pick up on that point. You're watching the France 24 debate.